In the years that followed, the firm of Spence and Hill began to gather momentum. We didn't represent a bank and we didn't represent the oil and mining companies, but we represented many of the local folks. State law provided that the county attorney could take on private cases so long as they weren't in conflict with his official duties. Already I was transferring the skills I had been learning as a prosecutor to the civil side of the law. I began trying any decent case that came along. I needed the experience, and Frank Hill and I could use the money. We had those families, like nests full of squawking baby birds, their mouths open and waiting. When it came time to make my decision as to whether or not to run for re-election, I decided against it. 4 years seemed enough. I was constantly at odds with the demands of my job as a prosecutor on the one hand, and my natural compassion for the wretched souls I had to prosecute on the other. Native Americans made up the largest ethnic numbers against whom I brought criminal charges. Poverty and crime are hateful brothers. As for the Native American, that so-called heathen, usually his only crime was that he'd become addicted to the white man's firewater. The Indians felt deep resentment at the white man's cruelty, which was plainly evidenced when the white culture attempted to force the Indian into the slavery of the white man's work ethic. Work was the invention of civilization. It was not work to roam the prairies or hunt for buffalo. It was not work to gather choke cherries. As Shamala, a Nez Perce chief, said when asked why his tribesmen refused to work, especially the young braves with strong bodies well suited for manual labor, "My young men shall never work. Men who work cannot dream, and wisdom comes to us in dreams." During my first term in office, I never lost a case as a prosecutor. I was learning how to survive in the courtroom. I thought I had made a difference. Frank Hill and I would be able to make it on our own private practice, and I was ready to pass the responsibilities on to some other lawyer. The office had served me well, and I had served the county. I thought I might be able to buy some property someday. I thought I was happy. I was beginning to feel like a successful lawyer. I believed I was a good parent, and over the years I'd tried to bury the devastation of my mother's suicide. The early years in Riverton were years when I grew from late childhood to early manhood, and the town had provided a sheltered place for my maturation. But when the last day for filing for re-election was at hand, and when I saw the lawyers who were running for my office, I decided I'd better run one more time to make sure that what I had planted grew. I was proud of what I'd accomplished in the county, and what had been hard to accomplish could be lost overnight if the wrong prosecutor got into office. I was elected by a large majority, and during my second term I tried many more cases, none of which I lost. Not that such a record stands for much. With all of the power prosecutors possess, they ought not to lose cases. At the end of my second term, I decided it really was time for me to move on. I had learned how to talk to a jury and how to try a case. I was still young, just 33. One day, Judge Sheldon was sitting in his office, his feet up on his gray steel desk, looking at me. Here was this kid who, as a wide-eyed puppy, had started in his office. The judge gave me a toothy smile. "Jerry, you have what it takes to become a great trial lawyer." I didn't know what to say. "What do you mean?" "That's all I got to say," he said, puffing on a cigarette. His words created a vision. Such visions, if honestly imparted, are the greatest gift one person can bestow upon another. To be a trial lawyer, that had become the ambition of my life. In 1962, I came to the curious conclusion that Wyoming deserved to have me, a young, aggressive, skilled trial lawyer in Congress. I would take Washington by storm. I would fight for the people, there make a name for myself, and maybe become President of the United States. Why not? I was convinced that merely prosecuting the poor who robbed back, and the forgotten who struck back, and the despised who hated back, did not fulfill my predestined role in the universe. It was time to burst into the big time. Moreover, something felt stifling to me in that small town of Riverton, like a child who had outgrown his playpen. I felt trapped in the town, but more, I felt the need to bloom, to become. My opponent was a nondescript, bland fellow by the name of William Henry Harrison, who'd already served in the House of Representatives for 3 terms. He was named after his grandfather, the 9th President of the United States. I filed in the Republican primary for Congress on the Republican ticket. My announcement, carried in all the newspapers in the state, created hardly a ripple. But I would knock on all the doors in the state and win again. I knew as much about running a statewide political campaign as a cowboy knows about the tax code. I brought in my brother Tom, then just 20, to help me run this thing I'd spawned. In those days I was flying a small Cessna airplane, and when we got to Casper, Tom called the Casper Star-Tribune, the state's largest and most powerful newspaper, had to have its support, at least its interest, at least its tolerance. "Jerry Spence is flying into town this afternoon," Tom said to Phil McCauley, editor-in-chief, with all the enthusiasm he could muster. "So what?" McCauley asked. "Don't you want to come out to the airport and meet him?" "What for?" McCauley asked. In reporting the election results, the Associated Press said Jerry Spence, Fremont County attorney, was drubbed decisively. I carried my own home county, Fremont County, and that's about all. I was crushed. I'd knocked on every door. I felt betrayed. Down where you really know things, I realized my run for Congress had been about escaping Riverton. I wanted to be free of everything that seemed to snare me, my marriage, my parents' teachings, my partnership. Within a few weeks I sat down with Frank. I wanted to end the partnership, I told him, and I thought that Frank needed to be free of me. Somehow Frank Hill, who had always understood, still understood. Frank kept our building, and I built a new one across the street. There I opened my solo practice devoted to the specialty of trials. My new office was a sanctuary where people could drag in their problems, and in front of a fire in the red stone fireplace, I would listen to my client's pain. In the center of the room I set a large, round oak table with oak captain's chairs to pull up. I would sit down with my client in a chair just like his, and without a desk separating us, we could talk, like people, like friends. Inside the small courtyard of my private office, I built a small waterfall that came tumbling down over the red stone, and the sound of the water soothed me. My isolation protected me and let me begin to heal. I hired Cleo Arguello, the Mexican-American wife of a quadriplegic client, whose husband I represented against Ford Motor Company, setting a record in Wyoming for personal injury verdicts. By her gentleness and quiet compassion, I was comforted. I built a bar inside my private office, and the sour mash whiskey also soothed me, or I thought it did. And of an evening my friends and I drank and laughed and spoke of ribald matters. We were a cynical lot, and my new deep cynicism sometimes soothed me, or I thought it did. The trap grew more oppressive, and I felt trapped by a marriage that had become a war with a roof over it. But I saw no way out. I was a married man, by this time a father of 4, a man with responsibilities, a father, a lawyer with duties to his clients. Often I stayed at the office late and drank with my friends into the night. "You're late for dinner as usual," Anna would scold. And then the fight would begin anew. She'd been at home all day working, taking care of kids, keeping a house. She'd prepared a dinner, and for whom? For a man who didn't care enough or respect her enough to come home at supper time? I was a tangled mass of pain and anger, and Anna was as trapped as I. Sometimes I would forego supper. Sometimes I'd just have another drink and stumble into bed. Sometimes Anna would drink with me, and at times that was better. And sometimes I couldn't remember, and sometimes I didn't care. On the cusp of crazy, desperate, I drank more. I thought of how it would be to die. I began to comprehend what must have been my mother's hopeless entanglement with a misery from which she could not escape. My God, I cried to myself, had I inherited my mother's propensity to self-destruction? At one point I said to Anna, "I'm crazy," I said. "You're not crazy," she argued. "You may be a little nuts sometimes. You may be mixed up. You may be hurt. But you're not crazy." It took a shrink in Denver to convince me that she was right. When I was an adolescent, my parents had suffered my revolt. So, in my manhood, the town of Riverton suffered my insurrection. I stomped capriciously, carelessly up and down the ribs of the town. More than once I heard a patient citizen sigh, "He's an insufferable son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." Only in the courtroom did I command the people's respect. If someone was in trouble, he came to me for advice. If a man was injured on the job, he came to me to fight for him against his employer. If a person was charged with a crime, he or she knew I could defend them. I fought for all of them, the lowly, the poor, and the powerless. I was their anger. I was their voice. As for my growing reputation as a trial lawyer, I knew what accounted for it. The consuming work, the meticulous preparing of every move, every detail, every question. I had become the hunter in the courtroom. And when people found it hard to understand why I didn't seem overjoyed when I won, I tried to explain. It wasn't joy I felt, but relief, like the gladiator who staggered from the arena, bloodied, saved to fight another war the next day, the next week. Each case was a final confrontation between life and death for me. But in the throes of a trial, my demons faded into legal briefs. The face of my mother dissolved into the faces of mothers clutching their dead children, mothers left penniless by delinquent husbands and beaten senseless by drunken spouses. In the heat of the trial, the tangled stuff within me was replaced with an indomitable anger that must have bewildered many of my opponents. Yet I was always afraid. My fear was of losing, for losing and betrayal, losing and failure, losing and dying had started to feel the same. It wasn't long before I began to set record verdicts for those times. One record verdict after another, verdicts in cases that shocked the judges and caused the lawyers in the state to shake their heads in disbelief. At one time, I held record verdicts in every category of personal injury case, libel, death cases, you name the damage record, I had it. I tried a wide range of cases, nearly always before a jury, and nearly always each verdict exceeded the last. It wasn't long before I was getting more for a sprained neck than I had previously gotten for a baby who had died. I told the juries the stories of my cases in the language of working people. I had learned storytelling from my father, for a true trial lawyer is a storyteller. Storytelling and listening to stories is in our genes. We hear stories and we're moved by them. Human beings do not respond to abstractions. If I were to choose but one skill from the grab bag of skills necessary for the successful trial lawyer, it would be the skill of storytelling. I hadn't lost a jury trial of any kind in over 10 years, but my successes, I thought, were attributable to the fact that my opponents were mostly mediocre regional lawyers who hadn't worked as hard or who didn't care as much. Eventually, I thought I would be found out by the real trial lawyers, those from Denver and Chicago and New York. Eventually, they would show me up for what I was, a frightened man with modest talent, a loud voice, a somewhat imposing demeanor, and great luck, and a man who, for many years, had been guilty of the tepid crime of overachieving.